It was an ordinary afternoon when Richard Manning, a 38-year-old construction worker, arrived home to find a large wooden box waiting on his doorstep. The package was wrapped in plain brown paper, with no return address or any identifying labels. It was as if someone had left it there, hoping it would simply disappear. The sight of it piqued Richard's curiosity. Richard had lived alone for the past 5 years after his divorce. He wasn't exactly lonely, but his routine had become predictable. He worked long hours, came home, made dinner, and spent his evenings watching TV or reading. His life had a certain rhythm, and anything out of the ordinary always caught his attention. He stood at the door for a moment, staring at the box. It was unusually heavy for its size, and the way it sat on the porch made it feel oddly out of place. Richard's first instinct was to leave it alone. Perhaps it was a mistake, maybe it was for one of the neighbors. But then again, there was a nagging thought in the back of his mind. The box didn't look like something that had just been misdelivered. It looked deliberate. He picked it up and carried it inside. His house was quiet, with only the occasional creak of the wooden floorboards as he moved through it. He placed the box on his dining table, the weight of it making a hollow sound as it landed. Richard sat down and examined the box. It was made of rough-hewn wood, not the polished kind you'd expect from a furniture store, but something that looked handcrafted. The edges were worn, the corners slightly chipped. There was something old-fashioned about it, as if it had been sitting around for years, waiting for someone to find it. Curiosity got the better of him, and he reached for his pocket knife, the same one he carried with him on the job. He sliced through the paper wrapping, revealing the wooden surface. It wasn't exactly locked, but it had a heavy metal clasp securing it shut. As Richard unlocked the clasp, he felt a sense of anticipation building inside him. What was inside this box? What kind of package could warrant such a strange delivery? With one final tug, the clasp came undone, and Richard slowly opened the box. At first, all he could see was darkness, deep, impenetrable darkness. The inside of the box seemed like an abyss, like it was hiding something. Then, as the lid was fully raised, Richard froze in shock. There, inside the box, was a young woman. At first glance, Richard thought he was imagining things. The woman was curled up tightly, her knees drawn to her chest, her body wrapped in what looked like a tattered blanket. Her long hair fell over her face, but he could see that she was breathing slow, shallow breaths that seemed almost too fragile. Richard's heart raced as he stepped back from the box. He'd never seen anything like this before. He felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. Was this some kind of sick joke? He had no idea who this woman was or how she had ended up inside his house. She didn't look like she had been injured, but she also didn't look entirely well. He was about to reach for his phone to call the authorities when he noticed something even more unsettling. The woman's clothes were old-fashioned, not the kind of attire you'd expect anyone to wear in this day and age. She was dressed in a faded dress, the fabric worn thin with age. Her shoes were also strange, leather sandals, but not the kind you'd find in any store today. Richard's mind raced. Was this some kind of human trafficking situation? Had she been kidnapped and left here as a message? He didn't know what to think, but something told him he needed to act fast. He knelt beside the box, carefully trying not to startle her. "Hey, are you okay?" he asked, his voice low and cautious. The woman didn't respond. Her eyes remained closed, and her body remained motionless. Richard's heart sank as he realized she might not be conscious. He reached out and gently touched her shoulder, trying to wake her. "Hey, wake up," he said again, a little louder this time. She stirred slightly, but it wasn't enough to fully rouse her. Richard's concern grew. Was she even alive? The fear that she might be dead or in critical condition gripped him. But then, just as he was about to shake her a little more forcefully, her eyes fluttered open. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Richard could see the fear and confusion in her eyes. She blinked rapidly as if trying to understand where she was. Her lips parted, but she didn't say anything. Richard didn't know what to do next. He felt an overwhelming urge to help her, but he had no idea who she was or what had brought her here. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice trembling slightly now. He couldn't keep the worry out of his tone. What happened to you? The woman's gaze shifted, and for a moment, she didn't seem to recognize him. Then, just as quickly, her expression changed to one of pure panic. She scrambled to get out of the box, her movements frantic, but she didn't seem to have the strength to stand. Richard immediately reached out to help her, pulling her gently from the box. As he did, he noticed something even stranger. There was something written on the inside of the box, almost as if it had been scratched into the wood. It wasn't clear at first, but as Richard squinted, he could make out the faint letters. "Help me. Don't trust them." Richard froze. Was this a warning? Who had written this, and what did it mean? Before he could process it further, the woman let out a gasp, and Richard turned his attention back to her. She was trembling in his arms, and her eyes were wide with fear. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Then, in a whisper that barely reached his ears, she said the one thing Richard would never forget: "They're coming." Richard's mind raced as he held the woman in his arms, her body trembling uncontrollably. Her words echoed in his mind. "They're coming." Who was she talking about? And why did she look so terrified? He wanted to ask more questions, but the look in her eyes made it clear that time was running out. Whatever was happening, it was bigger than just this strange box and its contents. The woman's head rested against his chest, and Richard could feel her shallow breaths against his shirt. He didn't know how much time he had, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't let her stay here. He needed to get her somewhere safe. But where? His mind raced through the options. The police? No, that seemed like the obvious choice, but if she was really running from something dangerous, he couldn't risk alerting whoever was after her. As he stood up, gently cradling her in his arms, Richard heard a noise, a faint thud coming from the direction of the front door. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. Had they already found him? The thought sent a cold chill down his spine. "Stay here," Richard whispered to the woman, his voice barely audible. He didn't know if she could understand him, but it didn't matter. He carefully placed her back on the couch, making sure she was comfortable, and then rushed to the door. He peeked through the curtains, trying to get a glimpse of what was outside. First, he saw nothing. The street was eerily quiet, with no sign of anyone approaching. But then, his eyes locked on a shadow moving across the sidewalk, too fast to be just a passerby. He quickly stepped back from the window and began to think through his options. If someone was out there, they wouldn't just knock. Richard wasn't sure who he was dealing with, but they weren't here for a friendly chat. Whoever was after the woman would be willing to do anything to find her, and they'd have no hesitation about making him their next target. His heart raced as he tried to think. If he locked the doors, would that keep them out? He glanced around the house. There were no security cameras, no alarms. His home was just a small, quiet place tucked away on the edge of the city. Felt safe. But now, with this strange woman in his living room, nothing felt safe anymore. Richard made a quick decision. He grabbed his phone and dialed the one number he knew he could trust. His brother, Sam, had served in the military. If anyone knew how to handle a situation like this, it was Sam. The phone rang twice before Sam answered. "Rich, what's up?" "I need your help," Richard said, his voice urgent. "Something's happening. I don't know what, but I have a woman here. She's scared, and I think someone's after her. I need you to come over. Now." There was a brief pause before Sam spoke again. "Okay, calm down. I'm on my way. Stay inside and lock up. Don't let anyone in." "I will," Richard replied, hanging up the phone. He felt a slight sense of relief now that he had a plan, but it was fleeting. He wasn't sure what kind of danger they were facing, but he was sure of one thing: things were about to get a lot more complicated. Richard hurried back to the living room to check on the woman. She hadn't moved, still curled up on the couch, her eyes closed, though her breathing had steadied. He wasn't sure if she was asleep or just exhausted. Her body had been through something, that much was obvious, but what? He couldn't stop thinking about the warning she had given him. "They're coming." Richard didn't have time to dwell on it. He had to act fast. He locked the front door, then moved to the windows, drawing the blinds and ensuring no one could see inside. His heart pounded as he moved through the house, securing every possible entry point. He couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was after this woman was already closing in on him. Minutes felt like hours as Richard waited for his brother to arrive. His hands were clammy as he paced the floor, his eyes constantly scanning the windows for any sign of movement. But all was quiet, too quiet. He tried to tell himself that it was just his mind playing tricks, but every creak of the house seemed amplified. Every shadow outside felt like it was hiding something. Then, just as he was starting to lose his patience, there was a knock at the door. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it made Richard's heart skip a beat. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. Was it Sam? Or had they found him? He approached the door slowly, his hand hovering over the handle. He didn't want to open it unless he was certain. Another knock, louder this time, followed by a voice. "Richard, it's me, Sam. Open up." A rush of relief flooded through Richard as he unlocked the door and swung it open. His brother stood there, dressed in tactical gear, looking every bit the soldier he had been. Sam's eyes immediately went to Richard, then to the woman sitting on the couch. "Is she okay?" Sam asked, his tone low and serious. "I don't know," Richard replied, his voice tight. "She's been in that box, and I don't know who put her there. But she's scared, and someone's after her." Sam nodded, stepping inside. "We need to move fast. We don't know who they are, but we can't afford to take any chances. Do you have a place we can hide her?" Richard thought for a moment. There was one option, but it wasn't ideal. His cabin out in the woods was isolated. It would be the perfect place to keep her safe, away from the prying eyes of whoever was looking for her. "I have a cabin," Richard said, glancing back at the woman. "It's a few hours away, but it's the only place I can think of where we can keep her safe." Sam gave him a sharp look. "Get her ready. We're leaving now." Richard moved quickly, gathering a few essentials and getting the woman ready for the journey. She didn't resist, but there was still a look of confusion in her eyes. She didn't seem to fully understand what was happening, but at least she wasn't completely out of it. He helped her into a jacket and guided her toward the door as they stepped outside. Richard couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The silence of the neighborhood had been unnerving, but now, as he and Sam made their way to the truck, he felt the weight of something much darker pressing down on him. They had no idea who was after the woman or why, but Richard knew one thing for certain. Things were about to get much more dangerous. The cold night air bit at Richard's skin as he helped the woman into the back of the truck. Sam, already in the driver's seat, started the engine with a low growl, the headlights cutting through the darkness. The truck's engine roared to life, shaking off the quiet tension that had settled over them. Richard climbed into the passenger seat, glancing back at the woman as she huddled under the blanket he had draped over her. She looked so fragile, so out of place. The fear in her eyes hadn't subsided, and Richard couldn't help but wonder who would go to such lengths to hide someone away in a box. And why? What had she seen? What had she been through? "Is she okay?" Sam asked, keeping his eyes focused on the road as they drove down the quiet street. "I don't know," Richard replied. "She hasn't said much. Just, they're coming." He shook his head, trying to make sense of her cryptic words. "She was in that box when I found her. I don't even know how she got there or who put her in it. It's like she's been trapped." Sam was quiet for a moment, the only sound the rumbling of the truck and the occasional hum of the tires on the road. "It doesn't make sense," he muttered. "But we're gonna figure it out. First, we need to get her to the cabin. If they're really after her, we'll be safer there for now." Richard nodded, but something still gnawed at him. It wasn't just the woman in the truck. It was the strange, unnerving feeling that had settled in his gut ever since the package arrived. Something didn't add up, and he had no idea what kind of trouble he was walking into. As they drove farther from the city, the roads became less familiar. The houses faded into the distance, replaced by dense woods and dark fields. Richard had always found the isolation of the cabin comforting, but tonight, it felt ominous. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being followed. Every now and then, he glanced in the rearview mirror, but all he could see was the stretch of road behind them, empty and desolate. He wished he could shake the nagging doubt that something was out there. Watching them, Sam's grip tightened on the steering wheel, as they entered a stretch of road known for being desolate. "You're right," Sam said, his voice low. "Something's not right about this. Whoever's after her, whoever put her in that box, probably knows exactly where we're going." Richard's pulse quickened. "So we can't stop, right? We keep moving." "Exactly." Sam's eyes flicked toward Richard, a flash of concern crossing his face. "We're gonna get to that cabin and we're gonna lock it down. No one gets in, no one gets out. We'll have to hunker down and wait for the storm to pass." Richard nodded, but the growing unease in his chest wouldn't let up. He glanced again at the woman in the back seat, whose wide eyes were fixed on the road ahead. She was trembling again, the blanket wrapped tightly around her, her body stiff. She didn't speak, but the terror radiating from her was undeniable. "Do you think she'll be okay?" Richard asked. "She's gonna be all right," Sam said, but there was a slight hesitation in his voice. "We just need to keep our heads on straight. We don't know who or what's after her, but we can't afford to panic." The minutes ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The further they drove, the more isolated the road became. Richard looked at the trees lining the sides of the road, their gnarled branches twisting like dark fingers reaching toward the sky. It was as if nature itself was conspiring to keep them in this shadowy world. Finally, after what felt like hours, they reached the cabin, nestled deep in the woods. Richard's cabin was a small, unassuming structure. It had been his refuge after his divorce, a place to get away from the noise of the city. There were no neighbors for miles, and the only sounds were the rustling of the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl. It had always been peaceful, but tonight it felt like a trap. Sam turned the truck into the narrow driveway, the headlights illuminating the outline of the cabin. Richard's breath caught in his throat. There was something wrong, something about the way the shadows moved in the woods, the way the night seemed to hold its breath. He didn't voice his concerns to Sam, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he scanned the surroundings. Was someone watching them from the trees? "Let's get inside," Sam said, his voice firm, as he parked the truck. He turned to Richard. "You stay with her. I'll check the perimeter." Richard nodded and quickly climbed out of the truck. He helped the woman out of the back seat, careful not to jar her fragile form. She was still too shaken to walk on her own, but Richard didn't want to waste any time. He led her toward the front door of the cabin, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. The door creaked as he opened it, and the smell of pine wood and earth filled his nostrils. Inside, it was dim, but Richard knew his way around. The living room was sparsely furnished, with only a few old couches and a fireplace that had long since gone cold. He guided the woman toward the couch and gently helped her sit down. "Are you all right?" Richard asked, crouching in front of her. He placed a hand on her shoulder, trying to offer comfort, but her eyes remained wide with fear. She didn't answer, but her lips trembled. Richard glanced at Sam, who was already heading around the back of the cabin to check for any signs of intruders. Richard was left alone with the woman, and the silence between them grew heavier. His mind raced. He wanted to ask her more questions, to find out who she was and what had happened to her, but it was clear she wasn't ready to talk. She was too scared, too lost in whatever nightmare had brought her here. Suddenly, a noise outside caught Richard's attention. A twig snapping, the sound of footsteps on the gravel driveway. He froze. Was it Sam coming back? Or something or someone else? Richard's pulse quickened as he moved to the window. The silhouette of a figure stood near the trees, watching. The moonlight illuminated their face just enough to make out a pair of cold, calculating eyes. Richard's breath caught in his throat as he realized the terrifying truth. They were already here. Richard's heart raced as he backed away from the window, his hand instinctively reaching for the nearest weapon. The intruder outside hadn't moved, but the figure was unmistakable. The cold, calculating eyes stared back at him from the dark shadows near the trees. Whoever it was, they were waiting, and it was clear they weren't here to chat. He turned toward the woman on the couch, who was now looking around the room with a mixture of confusion and dread. Her wide eyes met his, and for a moment, It was as if she could sense the danger closing in on them. Richard moved swiftly across the cabin, locking all the windows and closing the blinds. Every sound, every creak of the old house seemed louder now. His mind raced as he tried to formulate a plan. There was no way he could fight off whoever was out there alone. And even if Sam was back inside, the cabin was too isolated. If they were surrounded, there would be nowhere to run. He needed to think quickly. "Stay here," Richard whispered to the woman, his voice low but firm. She didn't move, didn't respond, but her gaze never left him. She seemed to understand the urgency in his tone. He grabbed a flashlight from a nearby shelf and checked the battery. It flickered weakly, barely illuminating the darkness around him. It would have to do. As Richard moved toward the door, he paused, listening for any sounds that would indicate the intruder's next move. There was nothing. The silence was suffocating. Then a sharp knock echoed from the door, followed by a voice, a low, almost gravelly tone. "Open up, Richard. We know you're in there." Richard froze. The voice was unfamiliar, but there was something about it that sent a chill down his spine. The intruder was no longer hiding in the shadows. They knew he was here. And worse, they knew his name. "Who the hell is that?" Richard muttered under his breath. He didn't answer the knock. Instead, he moved silently to the back door where Sam had gone earlier. It was the only other exit, and if things got worse, he needed a way out. He carefully opened the door, just enough to peek out, but when he saw no sign of Sam, panic started to creep in. He stepped outside cautiously, his flashlight casting long, distorted shadows along the cabin's back wall. "Sam." Richard called quietly, hoping his brother was nearby. There was no answer. But then, a sound, one that Richard had hoped he wouldn't hear, a rustling in the bushes near the back of the cabin. It was too close. Whoever had been watching the front of the cabin was now moving around to the back. Richard's pulse quickened. He had to act fast. He closed the back door as quietly as he could, then hurried to the living room where the woman was still sitting on the couch, looking more terrified than ever. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "We need to go now. They're outside." The woman didn't say anything, but her eyes widened in panic. Richard's hand moved to his phone, but he stopped himself. Calling the police would take too long. He had no idea how many people were out there or what kind of resources they had. All he knew was that they were closing in on the cabin, and fast. Just as he was about to grab her by the arm and rush her to the back door, the front door burst open with a loud bang. Richard's blood ran cold. A tall man stepped inside, his face hidden in the shadows, his posture imposing. He wasn't alone. Another figure entered behind him, this one shorter but equally menacing. They both had the same cold, calculating look in their eyes. "We're not here to hurt you, Richard," the tall man said, his voice calm but full of authority. "We're here for her." Richard's grip tightened around the flashlight, but he didn't move. The woman, her face pale with fear, looked at Richard as if silently pleading for him to do something, anything. But what could he do against these men? The shorter man stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the woman. "Come with us and no one gets hurt." Richard's mind was racing. He couldn't let them take her. Not now, not after everything that had happened. But how could he stop them? "Who are you?" Richard asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "What do you want with her?" The tall man didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned to his companion, who was already moving toward the woman. The shorter man reached down, grabbing her by the arm roughly. Richard stepped forward, blocking his path. "You're not taking her." The tall man's eyes narrowed, and for a brief moment, Richard thought he might pull out a weapon. But instead, the man just smirked. "We don't need to take her, Richard. She's already ours. You just don't know it yet." Before Richard could react, the man lunged forward, knocking the flashlight from his hand. The impact sent Richard stumbling backward, his chest slamming into the coffee table. The woman screamed, but it was drowned out by the sound of footsteps pounding across the cabin. The shorter man yanked the woman to her feet, pulling her away from Richard. "Let her go." Richard shouted, his voice filled with desperation, but it was too late. The woman's terrified gaze locked with his for one final, fleeting moment before she was dragged toward the door. Richard lunged toward them, but the tall man was faster. He grabbed Richard by the shoulders, slamming him against the wall with a strength that took Richard's breath away. "We warned you," the tall man said, his voice cold and final. "Now you're going to wish you never opened that box." Richard struggled to break free, but the man's grip was like iron. His vision blurred as the pressure on his chest tightened, but just as he thought he might pass out, the door slammed shut. In the silence that followed, Richard's heart pounded in his chest. The woman was gone, and all that was left was the eerie, oppressive silence of the cabin. Richard lay slumped against the wall, struggling to breathe. His chest ached where the tall man had slammed him and his head swam with a mix of confusion, anger, and desperation. The door had slammed shut and the sounds of the intruders were fading, taking the woman with them. For a long moment Richard couldn't move. The pain in his chest was too great. But then the reality of what had just happened set in. They took her. The woman who had been trapped inside the wooden box, the woman whose life had somehow been linked to this strange, inexplicable situation, was now in the hands of people who clearly knew more than Richard did. He pushed himself to his feet, his body heavy with exhaustion. He stumbled toward the door, his hand shaking as he reached for the handle. But before he could turn it, a sudden thought struck him. What if they were still outside? What if they were waiting for him to come outside? His mind raced, but there was no time to waste. He couldn't let them get away with her. Not now. Not after everything he had seen. Richard quickly grabbed his coat and moved toward the back door again. He needed a way out, a way to track them down. But as he reached for the door, a faint sound reached his ears, the soft click of a lock. His heart skipped a beat. Someone had been inside. Someone else was here. Without thinking, Richard grabbed a nearby chair and jammed it against the door, barricading it. It wasn't much, but it bought him a few extra moments. He could hear faint footsteps outside, moving slowly, cautiously. Whoever had just entered the cabin was being careful, as if they knew he might be looking for them. Richard backed away from the door, his breath coming in shallow bursts. His mind was racing, but the fog of panic clouded his thoughts. He had to keep it together. He had to stay calm if he was going to get the woman back. Then, the cabin door swung open and Richard spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing in the doorway was Sam, his face pale, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "Sam!" Richard exclaimed, rushing toward him. "Where the hell have you been?" I don't know, man," Sam said, his voice shaky. "I went to check the perimeter, like you said, and then I heard voices. But when I got back, I couldn't find you. What happened? Where is she?" Richard felt a surge of relief wash over him. He wasn't alone. Sam was back. But that relief was quickly replaced with a bitter taste of anger. "They took her," Richard said, his voice hoarse. "They came in, dragged her out," and he stopped himself, shaking his head in frustration. "I couldn't stop them. I wasn't fast enough." Sam stepped into the cabin, his eyes scanning the room. "You were right about one thing," he said, his voice quieter now. "They're still out there. I saw them moving around in the woods. But there's something off about this whole thing, Richard. These people, whoever they are,